It is 4:30 p.m. in the evening of October 15th, 1987. Inside an important meeting room at the Cousse de la Tourne headquarters in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. An army captain is seated quietly among a small group of officials. Inside this room sat some of the most important men in his government. Among them was Henry Zongo, the country's then Minister of Economic Promotion. Seated just a few feet away was Major Jean-Baptiste Legiani, one of the most powerful military figures in Burkina Faso. And around them sat several other senior government officials. Some were taking notes, some were listening quietly, while some were discussing the future of the country. But while the ministers discussed the future of Burkina Faso, unknown to them, another secret meeting with no official records or cameras was already taking place few meters away from where they were. Inside this meeting were a handful of armed men. One of them had a familiar face, a face the army captain in the first meeting room would never have suspected, because this was a man he had fought beside, planned with, and laughed with, a man he called a brother. But in that secret room, something had changed. The loyalty that had once bound those men together was no longer enough, because the conversation in that second room was not about Burkina Faso's future. It was about something far more specific, about who would walk out of that first meeting room alive and who would become history. And sitting inside that secret room was a man who already knew the answer. But the strangest part of this story is that the man whose fate was being discussed had no idea he was the target. At least, not yet. Because inside the first meeting room, the army captain continued as normal, listening, discussing, and planning, completely unaware that somewhere else in the city, other men had already begun discussing a future without him. And perhaps that raises an even bigger question. Who was this army captain? What made him so important, and why would anyone want him removed? But the story did not begin on October 15th, 1987. It began years earlier with an idea, long before the betrayals and secret meetings. At a time when he was still a young military officer living in one of the poorest countries on earth. Every day he saw the same thing: poverty, hunger, and dependence. And the more he saw, the more one question began to haunt him. Why was a continent so rich, filled with people who had so little? That question would eventually make him a hero to millions and a threat to people far beyond Burkina Faso. His name was Thomas Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso, and the most dangerous man in Africa to the people who wanted him gone. But the story of his death is actually the least interesting part of this story. The real story is why so many powerful people wanted him gone.
Burkina Faso is a name drawn from the land itself.
Why did you want to change the name of Upper Volta?
Yes, because Upper Volta, it meant nothing to anyone, especially to us Burkinabe. It's a name that only reminds us of a colonial past. On the other hand,
October 15th, 1987, Sankara woke up like any other morning, with no presidential motorcade or armed convoy waiting outside. At least, that was his usual way. While other African presidents surrounded themselves with luxury, he refused it. Instead, he drove himself and lived modestly in a country he had spent 4 years trying to save. And that morning, he had no reason to believe that day would be any different. But something was already in motion, something he could not see, though not yet. Earlier that same week, Thomas had said something publicly in front of witnesses, and this was on record. He said, "Revolutionaries can be killed, but you cannot kill ideas." The people who heard it laughed, clapped, and celebrated. But the people watching from a distance heard something different. They heard a man who already knew the evil happening behind the scene. And this eventually triggered some form of discomfort, because in the days leading up to October 15th, he had been warned by people close to him, by intelligence reaching his office, and by a feeling that something bad was actually coming for him. But still, he never attempted to run, hide, or ask for any form of protection. That gesture alone had sent endearing signals to them, as if saying, "I know you're coming for me, and I'm not afraid of you." Wait. Just hold on. But here's the most interesting part of this story. By late afternoon, he was inside the Crusade Laton building in a meeting with his ministers, officials, with men he had worked alongside for years. And outside that quiet building, at exactly 4:15 p.m., a vehicle pulled up outside. Armed men stepped out, moving fast with purpose and like men who already knew exactly where they were going and who they were actually looking for. The first shots were fired outside. His bodyguards fell. Inside the meeting room, everything stopped. Chairs cracked, men ducked, voices rose, and Sankara stood up. He calmly told the men around him to stay down and gently walked towards the door alone, with his hands raised as if he already knew that what was coming through that door was meant only for him. 12 bullets fired in seconds. He fell, and that was his end. He was just 37 years old. But here's the most disturbing part of this story. The men who sent those soldiers were already breathing easier, thousands of miles away, in rooms that were not in Africa. Here's what they did not expect. Thomas was actually right. You cannot kill an idea, because the question his death left behind was louder than anything he ever said while he was alive. But the biggest question was never about the bullets. Bullets are cheap. The real question is, who ordered them? Who picked up a phone and decided that this guy here, in this small landlocked country, needed to be erased? And more importantly, why? What did he do that was so threatening, so dangerous, so absolutely unacceptable that the only solution was to put 12 bullets in him, in his own building, in his own country, by his own people? That answer is what they have spent decades trying to make sure you never find. Because the answer is not just about one man or one country. It is about a strange pattern that started long before Sankara was born and did not end when he died. To understand how this pattern began, I need you to travel back with me to the Republic of Congo. The year was 1960. A young leader was about to become one of the most powerful men in Africa. And somewhere else, thousands of miles away, other men were already discussing how to stop him. June 30th, 1960, Libreville, the Congo, Independence Day. The streets were overflowing, people were singing, children were dancing, while strangers were embracing each other. Maybe not all of them. But for the first time in generations, the future seemed to belong to them. A nation was being born, and across the Congo, millions believed they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. What they did not know was that somewhere else, other men were watching too. And on a stage in front of the entire world, a young man walked up to a microphone. Nobody knew it then, but the next few minutes would change the course of African history. Because standing behind that microphone was a man who was about to say something that powerful people had spent decades hoping nobody would ever say. Not because what was going to be said was violent or threatening a war, but because every single word was true.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. À vous tous, mes amis, qui avez lutté sans relâche à nos côtés, je vous demande de faire de ce 30 juillet 1960 une date de la signification à vos enfants pour que ceux-ci, à leur tour, fassent connaître à leurs fils et à leurs petits-fils l'histoire glorieuse de nous. Connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres. Qui oubliera qu'à un noir, on disait duc, non certes comme à un ami, mais parce que les voix honorables étaient réservées aux seuls blancs.
Il y a beaucoup de choses dans notre corps, dans notre développement colonialiste. Nous vous le disons, tout cela est désormais fini.
He told his people that Congo's wealth belonged to the Congolese people, that the suffering, exploitation, and generation of foreign rule was over. Congo was finally free. The crowd erupted, but thousands of miles away, another reaction was gradually unfolding, a much quieter one. Because sitting inside government offices, diplomatic circles, and rooms the public would never see were men who had just watched something deeply troubling. They just watched a young African leader tell millions of people that their game was over. And from that moment on, his days were numbered. His name was Patrice Lumumba. And for exactly 67 days, Lumumba remained in power. Then the phone call started. Years later, the classified CIA documents will reveal something extraordinary but very surprising. Officials had discussed a plan to poison him using something as ordinary as a toothpaste. Think about that for a moment. A prime minister, the leader of a newly independent nation, reduced to a target. But by then, the conversation had already moved far beyond poison, because some people no longer wanted Patrice Lumumba removed from office. They wanted him removed permanently. And on January 17, 1961, their wish came true. Lumumba was taken to a field, shot, and afterwards his body was dissolved in acid so that nothing would remain. No grave, no memorial, no bones. He was just 35 years old. And what Africa lost that night was not just a prime minister, it lost the possibility. The possibility that one of the richest countries on earth might finally control its own destiny. A possibility that terrified some people and inspired others. But on that night, in that field, that possibility died with him. But the pattern wouldn't stop, because 2 years later, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo, a man who looked at France's post-independence agreement and said something nobody had dared to say: no. He refused to keep Togo's money in Paris, refused to use France's currency, refused to let his country's independence exist only on paper. And on January 13, 1963, Olympia walked out of his own front door and was shot on his own doorstep just 3 months after saying no to France. Barely 3 months. And then the resistance ended. The man who replaced him agreed to France, the very agreement Olympia had spent years refusing. And just like that, the hope of the Togolese was buried with one bullet. Then there was the one they could not ignore, Muammar Gaddafi. Whatever the world told you about this man here, I want you to set it aside for one moment and look at what he was planning. A plan that his supporters believed could change Africa's financial future, reduce dependence on foreign currency, and challenge systems that had existed for decades. And if it succeeded, the balance of financial power in Africa might look very different from what we have today. Officially, the intervention was presented as a humanitarian mission, but years later, emails made public through US government records added another layer to the story, one that involved gold, money, and a proposed African currency, and his plan to use it to free Africa from French financial control. That was the one they could not ignore, because unlike the others, he wasn't trying to reform a country, he was trying to change a continent. On October 20th, 2011, Gaddafi was found hiding in a drainage pipe and killed. And what African lost was the closest it had ever come to financial independence. A single currency backed by African gold, controlled by Africans, gone, along with the man who dreamt it. The stories sound alike. 4 men, 4 countries, 4 decades, different faces, different flags, and different speeches. Yet, somehow, the same ending. Because the deeper you look, the more the same fingerprints begin to appear. The same pattern, interest, and outcome, which leads to an even more unsettling question. Who keeps giving these orders? For every African leader who was removed, something curious happened afterwards. Nobody claimed responsibility. No government stepped forward. No official made a confession. Not even a name appeared in any headline. Just silence. And for a long time, that silence worked. Questions remained unanswered. Witnesses disappeared, and the truth seemed buried. But silence has a weakness. It rarely survives forever. Because decades later, documents began surfacing quietly in government archives, in declassified intelligence files, in emails that were never meant for public eyes. And as those documents emerged, a pattern began to reveal itself. Not a theory or rumor, but a trail. One that led to rooms the public was never supposed to see. Until now, in 1975, the United States Senate Committee began investigating CIA's activities around the world, including Africa. What they uncovered remained buried for years, locked away in reports, files, and government records. But when those documents finally surfaced, they revealed something extraordinary. The CIA had directly discussed the removal of Patrice Lumumba, and the most unsettling part was not what was discussed, it was where it was discussed. Not in some secret basement or dark rooms, but in an official meeting, with minutes and record, and with people taking notes, as though the fate of an African prime minister was just another item on that agenda. And perhaps the most disturbing part of all, the man who approved it was nowhere near the Congo. He wasn't standing in that field. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He wasn't even on the same continent. In fact, he may never have set foot in the Congo at all. He simply gave an instruction, and somewhere else, other men carried it out. But as disturbing as that sounds, the Congo was not unique, because when he moved from Washington to Paris, you begin to see the same pattern again. For decades, a man operated quietly inside the shadows of the French state. Most Africans had never heard his name, yet his fingerprints seemed to appear everywhere. His name was Jacques Foccart. He was never elected, never the president, never the face of the government, and yet, for over 40 years, he controlled France's relationship with Africa. Every African leader who cooperated with France had Foccart's support, and any African leader who refused had Foccart's attention. And Foccart's attention was not something you survive easily. Over time, he became associated with nearly every major French intervention in Africa. Presidents came and went, government changed, yet his influence remained. And for many observers, one question kept appearing: how much power did this man really have? The man who decided which African leaders stayed and which ones did not. He died in 1997 in his bed peacefully, while the leaders he removed were long buried, and the countries he helped control are still paying the price till today. Foccart is gone, but the system he helped build is not. Because here is the most uncomfortable truth. In this entire documentary, the phone calls did not stop. The rooms did not close. The meetings did not end. At this moment, they just became harder to see. The road in Ouagadougou is quiet now. The building where it happened still stands. The city still moves and life still continues, just like it did that afternoon before everything changed. And somewhere in that city, Thomas Sankara's grave is simple, with no monument, palace, or gold, just a name and a date. The same man who refused a palace while he was alive has no palace in death, and yet across Africa, his face still appears on walls, murals, t-shirts, and on the lips of young people who were not even born when he died. Because he was right about one thing: you cannot kill an idea. And perhaps that is the real verdict. It is not whether if all these men were right. History will debate those questions forever. But there is something much harder to ignore. All four men believed Africa should have greater control over its future and its resources, and all four paid a price. And the surprising factor is that they were from different countries, in different decades, and in different circumstances. Yet somehow the same ending, which leaves us with a question: why do some ideas survive longer than the people who carry them? Why are these names still remembered and discussed till today, even after decades of their death? Because those men did not just leave graves behind, they left questions. Questions that Africa is still trying to answer. And perhaps the biggest question of all is: will you say no, knowing what it cost? Will you challenge the system, knowing what happened to those who came before you? Because an Africa that finally says no, means it, and survives it is one of the most powerful forces the world would ever witness. The question is, what happens the day it finally does? If this documentary moved you, share it with one African who needs to hear it. Because the next leader who says no might be watching this right now. My name is Bradofo, and I will see you in my next video. Please do not forget to subscribe. Thank you.